everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today, we're going to talk about how I think the kink community has changed in the last approximately almost 10 years or so. So I became a literal card-carrying member of the kink community in March of 2015. Literally, I had a membership card, a physical card, to a BDSM dungeon in March of 2015. Now, I had already been experimenting with exploring kink for maybe a month before then. So late February of 2015 was when I was first discovering BDSM. And now it is July, almost August of 2024. Time really does fly. We are 9 years into my kink journey at this point, and I'm getting to that time where I can start to say things like, well, back in my day, blah, blah, blah. And so to take advantage of that, I thought it would be fun to sort of reflect on how things have evolved over the last almost decade of the scene, because especially with social media and the internet, things can go from one thing to another very, very quickly. And I have about 10 things here on a list that I want to share. I don't have a script, but I do have some notes of what I want to talk about. And we're just going to go ahead and get into it. So one thing that I have noticed that has been a positive change, I believe, for the kink community is having a lot more open diversity with understanding what different genders can do within BDSM. So when I was first getting into the scene, the number one kink that I wanted to try was pet play. That was what really brought me into discovering kink originally. And at the time, there were not very many reputable online sources for information about kink in general, but especially about pet play. And a lot of the older websites, older blogs and such that talked about pet play were very prescriptive in terms of gender, like boy equal puppy, girl equal kitty. So for a solid 2 weeks at the very, very start of my kink journey, I thought, well, because I'm a girl, I have to be a kitten pet player because that is what people expect. And especially on Instagram, which used to be one of the main social media hubs for kinky people, that was also the main thing I was seeing. People in my age demo at the time, so people who were 18 to 25, almost all of them, 99% of them, were kittens, and they were cis women, and that was basically what you saw. You occasionally got a possum, a fox, but you didn't really get puppies per se. And I would go to events, and I would have especially older men assume that because, I'm pretty femme and all of that other stuff, that I must be a kitten. I could literally, and I've told the story before, I could be barking at a tennis ball, chasing after it, whole 9 yards, and they would still tell my partner, if I was with a partner at the time, oh, what a cute kitty you have. And it's she's barking at a ball. What else do you want? What do you want me to do? How else can I convince you this? But I don't think there was any sort of intentional effort to change this on the part of people who used to have more hardline beliefs as far as gender and different kink roles go. But I think over time, also, hello dog, welcome. Thank you for coming in here. I was talking about dogs. You heard me. Anyways, I was talking about how I don't think anything really changed through any sort of effort necessarily. People being I need to be more inclusive, but just I think this shows more how representation is really important, visual representation, people being at events, being out there and just showing, hey, I can be non-binary and a dragon. I can be agender and a fox. I can be a bi-gender raccoon. I can be a female puppy player. You can be any combination and still do not just pet play, but any kind of kink. And I think now it's much more routine that I hear people talk in ways that are more inclusive of gender by default, as opposed to talking in ways that are much more gendered. Because also with power exchange too, that was a really big thing. The older books and blogs about power exchange, especially if it was written from like a pansexual or a straight perspective. It's very male dom, female sub. When I'm writing a book talking about dominance, it's all like he the whole time, and then she for like if somebody's a submissive or a bottom. And I've really seen that change. Like pretty much every book about kink in the last like definitely 5 years, but even like 7 or 8 years, all of them are like just very neutral, non-assuming of gender. Of course, I think oftentimes they're still framed in a way that assumes a heterosexual relationship. And if somebody only has experience doing straight BDSM, I'm not really going to fault them for like talking about kink in a way that's like bent towards that perspective, you know? So that's one that I think has been really good to see. And kind of building off of that with power exchange, one other thing that I've seen change as well is there's less gatekeeping about power exchange in terms of like how much do you have to do to count as doing like real power exchange. Because once again, when I was researching BDSM for the first time and there were like no YouTube videos about it, it was really just blogs. There was maybe like one podcast, I think. There was not really a whole lot out there. So it was kind of like FetLife groups, and we'll talk about FetLife later as well. That was more or less it. And in those older blogs, many of them were written in the early aughts, late 90s, and they were all very much like, if you want to do a power exchange, you have to do this like multi-step collaring process. You have a consideration collar, you have a training collar, you have a collar of protection, and then you have like a real final collar, and you have to have a contract and a collaring ceremony. And it was all like very by the numbers. It's this, and this, and that's just like the way that it's done. And I think that caused a lot of people early on to assume that they like couldn't do power exchange with their other kinks because like, well, how am I gonna fit in like a pet play dynamic into power exchange? Like I don't necessarily want to like mentally when I'm role playing as a puppy like have all these other things going on top of it. And over time, I've really seen people, like, I don't know, relax about it. Like, just like, now that it's not just like one person's blog on the internet, just like getting copied and pasted forever, we have just more diversity available of like what people can see for options in power exchange. Like, yes, you do have the more traditional, higher protocol MS type relationships, but you also have like DDLG or CGL type dynamics. You have ones that are very like gentle. You have ones that are very strict, but not necessarily 24/7. You have all different arrangements of how people manage to make it work. Long distance, part-time, non-24/7, living together, not living together, monogamous, polyamorous. Like there's just so many more ways of doing it. And I think now we're really focusing more as a community on like giving people the tools to know how to find a powered exchange relationship that will work for them. Like, how do you build a contract with things that are suited to you, not just following the like downloadable contract PDF you found on like, I don't know, like pdffiller.com or whatever. Like, how do you design a relationship that works for you and is sustainable long term? Now, I mentioned protection, and I don't have this one on my notes, so I'm going to add this as like a little bonus one here, just as a little quick side thing. When I was first coming up in the scene, protection and mentorship were huge. Like, maybe that was just the age I was at the time and where I was discovering kink, like on social media, Instagram, FetLife, but protection was a huge thing. And people, like, you would have people with dominance and, you know, boyfriends who did kink stuff with them. But you oftentimes also have people that would be like, on my FetLife profile, they'd have something written that's like, if you want to message me, you must message my protector, blah, blah, blah. And it was always like an 18-year-old girl with a protector who was like a 30-something, 40-something guy that maybe she didn't even like ever meet in real life. And it was like, oh, I'm going to like kind of like institutionalized white knighting where it's like, oh, I have this one guy that I trust who will filter all of my messages for me and dictate who gets to interact with me. And I think, and this is another thing we'll talk about with FetLife, is there were definitely less privacy and filtration tools. So maybe a protector would help with that. But honestly, the way that I saw that play out at the time was like, it was a lot of people pretending to not do power exchange while definitely doing power exchange without the typical negotiations, mutual obligations, and ethics going into it. And that led to a lot of, I think, hurt feelings. You know, it's like you're trying to have like an FWB relationship without the people involved communicating that's what they're doing. That's maybe not a good comparison, but that's how it felt. And it went from being something that was super common, and that was like a default way that, when you're new in the scene, the first thing you gotta find is like a protector or a mentor, and they're gonna like help you. Sorry, my dog is shedding right now, and she's like getting hair fluff in the air. She's like, right. She's like, I need to be pet human. You will pet me. But anyways, as I was saying, protectorship, mentorship, that was like the main thing that you would do. Oh, it's like step 2 after like making a FetLife account is like find a person to be your mentor protector. And that thankfully is not really a thing anymore. I'm glad we moved away from that one. That's been a really big positive in my opinion. One other thing I've also seen change quite a bit is mental health and neurodivergence is much more of a conversation. And by that, what I mean is back in the day, we only really had that one little fact that was like, oh, kinky people aren't any more mentally ill than the general population on average. And people clung to that. I think people were really afraid of reflecting that stereotype that a lot of people have that, oh, if you're kinky, you can't function normally, you are deranged, you have to do kink because something is wrong with your brain, basically. And people were very against open conversation about mental health, I think because of that reason. And over the last couple of years, like especially since like 2020, 2019, I've seen a lot more people spearhead open conversations about this. There was a couple of books that were done by Raven Caldera, and there's also a conference called Thrive that's been around for like 3 or 4 years now. And that's all about mental health, neurodivergence, and like talking about the reality of that. Instead of like sweeping it under the rug and pretending like it's not there, we have more opportunities to talk about, hey, like if I'm doing power exchange and my dominant partner has ADHD, like how do we work around that? How do we work with that? And I think that's been really positive because it's like now I think we're realizing how common it is in the scene. Like if I had to guess, rough ballpark of the percentage of people in the kink community that have some kind of neurospiciness happening, it's probably like a quarter. Like I think it's, if we're including like PTSD and chronic pain, like kind of under that umbrella, like it's solidly like a quarter of people, I'm pretty sure. Like it's extremely, extremely common. And that isn't a bad thing. I think we have to be better and continue working on balancing this like fear of public perception with like the reality and like working with that. And it doesn't make you like a bad or wrong person because you have ADHD and like you happen to enjoy bondage. Like I don't think that is in any way negative. And I think on both sides of the slash, we're just talking about it way more and not in the like, I feel like the model for a long time was like secretary, like I'm gonna dom you out of your like bad mental health problems. And that's like something we now know does not work. Sorry. And we're moving more towards both sides of the slash, working with their partners, having a more holistic view of how to approach things and like not just writing people off because like, oh, well, like I can't expect you to be a submissive because like, you have ADHD or whatever. I feel like I keep going back to that, but that's like what I'm thinking about, I guess. So yeah, we're just like talking about it more, which is really great. I would also say something we've really changed the conversation on as well is consent. Because back in the day, it was like SSC versus rec. And like, which one is your model? Do you like safe, sane, and consensual? Or do you like risk-aware, consensual kink? And like consensual was like the least controversial and talked about, at least from my perspective, part of those debates. Like, oh yeah, it's consensual. Like, okay, but now we're getting more and more into, okay, what does consent actually look like? Because I think originally, like in vanilla society, it's like, well, consent is like when someone says yes before something happens and then kind of just like stops there. And we saw a lot of people have issues where essentially they would say, well, but they never use their safe word, so it's kind of their fault that their consent got violated. And it's like, well, let's have a little bit more of a nuanced conversation here. Because I think now we understand more and more how trauma responses and power dynamics and experience levels and substance use and subspace can all impact somebody's ability to give and receive and withdraw consent. And that it's not a panacea to just say, well, but I never heard them say pineapple, so how was I supposed to know they were, having a terrible time the entire time I was doing something we explicitly did not negotiate for? Used to be that was something you could more get away with because people were just like, well, yeah, you're right, it's their responsibility. They should have just said their safe word. And now we kind of know, well, but like, freeze responses are a thing. And it's not just that you need to say yes ahead of time and like sign on the dotted line is like a one-time thing. Consent is an ongoing thing that continues throughout the entire scene, and it can be revoked at any time, and it's not just a one and done. And I think that change in perspective is still an ongoing process, and there is certainly resistance from some people about the way that we think about consent changing, but on the whole, I think it's gotten a lot better. I think it's also helped people be more compassionate towards others and also give us more ways to understand our own experiences where it's like, well, like, that didn't really go the way that I wanted it to, and, I didn't really think I could say my safe word because of this and this, or I went nonverbal, and then there's like a lot of self-blame that I think used to happen more, whereas now people understand, oh, trauma responses are a thing, being triggered is a thing, let's, have that as part of the calculation in these conversations, in the understanding. So consent is something we very much think about differently. And also, going off of that, just in general, abuse and consent violations are something we have very different conversations about. Like, I remember looking at some very disturbing message boards and blogs from before I was in the scene and when I was first coming up in like the mid 2010s, where there were a lot of people that legitimately thought, oh, well, if you have a DS relationship, that's like obviously implied consent for whatever your dom wants to do. So, like, you can't revoke your consent. And also, like, if they do anything to your body, well, you shouldn't have gotten into a power exchange relationship with them if you weren't comfortable going there with them, because all power exchange has to be 24/7 free use, I guess. Bizarre, but that was how a lot of people thought about it. Like, to the point where it's like, oh, well, if your partner leaves you, it's your right as a master to like go and chase them down and bring them back because, well, 5 years ago they signed a contract that said that they would like be your submissive. Like, what are we talking about here, people? What are we doing? But now I think we understand much more that, well, on just one thing too, both sides of the slash, submissives, doms, all identities, all different ways of approaching BDSM. Anyone can be someone who is a victim of a consent violation or abuse. It's not just women, it's not just submissives, it's anyone. I think that's been really helpful and great to see. Of course, we're still building with that, but that's like at least a conversation at all, as opposed to crickets, not even a thing that ever comes up. And that's something I'm actually a really big advocate for. I think that's something that we need to work on, and I'm really glad that we're doing it, but it was just not even something that we would think about like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, especially. So that's one thing I really like to see. And I think also events and event organizers are way better at handling consent violations that happen in their space. There's a lot more of, I don't know. There is still a culture of silence in a lot of places because it's very difficult to talk about things openly without risking getting sued. But there is at least, in many different places, more consistent reporting protocols, some kind of procedure in place. So that way people know what to do and what to expect ahead of time. Whereas before, like, people just thought bad things wouldn't happen and like you would just deal with it if it came up. Whereas now, ahead of time, people will have things in place for like, oh, if there's an incident and we need to report it or have somebody else report it, this is what we're going to do. This is who handles what. This is what a procedure is going to look like. And I'm really glad to see that because once again, that was like not really a thing that happened. I will say, I have also seen some changes that I don't necessarily like in this regard. Like, I feel like we were going good places, and then we kind of stepped back a little bit. Like, I was seeing a lot more progress with community sticking together and being like, oh, this is like one objectively extremely bad person who has hurt many, many, many people over years, and them getting blacklisted from like an entire tri-state vicinity. And now, like a couple years later, they're showing up to conventions. They're going to events, and it's like, well, because there's new people running the events, and they don't really know what happened, and they think everyone should have a second chance, and it's like, I know what happened in those stories. Like, we were at the events where this happened, people saw things, many, many eyeballs can corroborate these stories, and we're just gonna go, well, but like, it's been like 2 years, so maybe they should be allowed back? Like, that I'm not loving, but we still have room for improvement, and we're going in the right direction. I feel like I'm saying that a lot, but that is generally what I think is happening is we are making strides in the right direction, but we're not always fully where I wish we were all the time. The other thing that I'd say with FetLife. So FetLife, that's a big one. This is like a whole conversation I could probably have just talking about FetLife. I do have a video that's relatively recent talking about like FetLife's newer updates and how to use it. Used to be back in the day, FetLife, Wild Wild West. Not very many people knew about it. Like, it was not really in the eyeballs of the mainstream. And there were not necessarily a lot of great filters for interacting with people. Like, if you had an inbox, people could send messages to it. There weren't very many ways to filter things. And the interactions were just different. Like, you post a photo and then some guy from Italy would like comment on it. You'd be like, how did you find this? And you would have events, but it was only in-person events, and people were mostly on there just to socialize with people they already knew from other in-person events. It was not really a website for meeting people on the website necessarily. Whereas now, we have virtual events, we have so many new roles and gender options and relationship styles, so many more privacy features in terms of posts and photos and status updates, and who can message you. And that's been, I think, a complete game changer. If you have not been on FetLife for a while because you're like, well, I don't want weird people I don't know, not like, I don't want them to be able to message me. You can just totally lock down your inbox to friends only. You can make it so only your friends will see status updates or photos you post, or only you can see them. If you just want to have like a time capsule for yourself and your partner, like, it's so much easier to have a better level of privacy on FetLife with other FetLife users. The downside I've also seen happen is that there are more eyeballs on FetLife. Like, I have seen far-right newspapers and online publications mentioning FetLife. They know about it. They have taken screenshots from it. They have taken photos from it. They have doxed people's FetLife information before because they feel like it's justified as part of some kind of like journalistic investigation. Which we're gonna talk about that story soon in the next couple of weeks, but I would be careful about what you post on FetLife still because of that. We've always had kind of one-off stories every once in a while of something like this happening, usually with like an employer. Now it feels much more targeted. It has a much more explicitly political flavor to it that I'm not loving. And it makes me concerned about FetLife going forward because now it's much more commonly known than it was like 10 or 15 years ago. But FetLife is changing, I think, in a lot of ways for the better. I think I've seen people be less active on it in general. Like, you don't see people like casually socially interact the way you used to. People kind of log on, they find events, they message people that they met at an event, and that's kind of it. But that could also just be my own personal experience. Something along the lines with FetLife, like I was saying, there's more orientations and roles on there. Similarly, in the real life community, there's a lot more open acceptance of different orientations. Like, before, when I was coming up in the scene, there was a recognition of like gay/lesbian, bisexual, and straight. And that was kind of what it was. Sure, if you had something else going on, that was okay, but it was not openly talked about. It was very much, oh, there's the straight community, and then there's the gay community, and that's what the options are. I have now seen, in the last 2 years, events explicitly welcome in aromantic and asexual people. And maybe this is just for me because I am asexual, but to see that has been mind-blowing. Like, I did not expect 8 years ago that an international-sized convention would be like, in our statement of purpose or our about section, we're gonna say that we're a welcoming place for asexual people. Because historically, a lot of the language that is used in conversations about kink is very sexual, it's very hot, it's what turns you on, like, not very ace-friendly language. And so a lot of people have had barriers understanding how you can be ace and do kinky stuff. Like, like, today, like, I have recently had arguments online with young queer people who do not understand that you can do kink in a non-sexual way. But for some reason, it's the 50 and 60-year-olds who are like, well, I don't know, they're fine. Like, they maybe don't always personally get it, but they're much more relaxed. Even though they've been doing kink for 40 years, they're like, okay, like, I don't have any reason to gatekeep these people's experiences. They're welcome here. Why are we being so judgmental? Like, I can't tell what's going on in somebody else's head. Like, they're just much more at ease about all of it. And that is really refreshing to see. I'm a little bit worried the next generation will not pick up the torch on that one, fully at least, but it is getting better. There are munches for people that are non-binary. There are munches for people that are aromantic or asexual or demi. Like, we're making our own spaces in the kink scene, and we're also being welcomed into the kink scene in a more general capacity as well. So that's been really, really nice to see. I just, that gives me some hope. I would also say, and maybe this kind of connects to everything I've been talking about, there's been a sort of merger, if you will, between the online and real life kink spaces. Like, it used to be back in the day, which I've said 50 times now, I think so far in this video. You know, there was the real life kink scene, and then there were the online kinky people. And the online kinky people invented their whole own, like, new ways of talking about kink with, like, capitalization and, like, virtual callers. If you ever want to look it up and you're a little younger, it is embarrassing and interesting to read what people were doing to, like, simulate power exchange on, like, the early internet into, like, the mid-aughts, let's say. And it used to be there was much more of a dividing line, I feel like, between real life and online kinksters, where you would have people who only ever did, like, essentially online forum roleplay for kink. And then you had people who were going to dungeons who, like, found events through newspapers and mailing lists and word of mouth, and there was not necessarily a lot of overlap. And I think there was a degree of judgment where online kink is less real than real life kink, especially because at the time, the tools for doing online kink were basically just, like, texting in a forum, like, having forum messages go back and forth, and that was sort of where it went, or, like, emails, and uploading a single picture that took you 2 hours to open up, like, that was what you had to deal with. And now we have voice notes, we have video calls, we have group chats, we have all different kinds of messaging systems. Really, you can much more closely simulate an in-person kink relationship online compared to, like, 2005. Things have really, really changed in that time period. But also, there's a lot more of a fusion between real life and online, where, like, most real life kinksters are also on FetLife, because FetLife is where 90+% of kink events and dungeons and munches and classes, they're all going to be listed on there. And so if you want to do stuff in real life, you kind of have to be on the internet. And a lot of people supplement their real life relationships with online things. And there's less judgment and tension where it's like, oh, this is how real life, real kinksters do stuff. And this is how online kinksters do stuff. And, like, now it's much more muddled together, which I like that there's online events and munches, because that was not a thing. Like, pre-2019, there were not online classes. There were not online conventions it was real life or books or maybe a podcast, and that was it. So I am glad that has been something that has stuck and changed, because I know I have people in my audience who are from like Brazil and Japan and like countries that do not really have a solid real life community to be able to actually give education. So, I think that's been really positive. But it was interesting, like back in the day, like how much tension there seemingly was between two groups that have increasingly become closer and closer together. Okay, so this one's gonna be, I could do a whole video about this one. This might be controversial, but something that I have seen distinctly change as like this was a turning point that I personally witnessed, was the invention of age regression and pet regression. And I know I'm going to have people leaving me comments on my video about like, you don't understand, age regression is a coping mechanism and it's not sexual, it's totally different than age play. I remember this was happening like almost 10 years ago. Like, I have a distinct memory, and if anyone is watching me that was around on like, I don't know, Instagram or Tumblr in 2016, you probably saw it too. There was a person who was told, because they were a minor, that they could not participate in the online pet play community. So they went off as a minor and invented the term pet regression. And then they adapted stuff that had already come up from age regression like a year or two before, and then invented pet regression as a coping mechanism for trauma that was safer work for minors that just happened to involve BDSM terminology, BDSM gear from toy shops that were made by adults for other adults and had caregivers and had power exchange relationships that I guess weren't really power exchange relationships. Like, the lines were blurred. Like, essentially, in my opinion, a lot of the beginnings of especially pet regression, but also age regression to a certain extent, was very like minors being upset that they were not allowed in adult kink spaces online. And they just went, well, but I want to do safer work age play. So I'm going to invent my own hashtag. I'm going to invent my own thing, and I'm going to like make whatever. And so there, again, I don't know how to stress this to you all. I saw this happening in real time on Tumblr, on Instagram, where I saw people who I knew were accounts that had previously been discovered to be minors trying to do kink, then went, oh, what I'm going to do is age regression, and I'm going to take this like outdated therapy modality that like basically no practicing therapist actually uses in their office anymore, and I'm gonna say that's what I'm doing as a way to heal my trauma, while also taking lots of cutesy aesthetic photos and wearing all the same gear, all the same clothes, using the otherwise like the same hashtags and terminology for everything that I'm doing, but it's not icky, dirty, gross, bad, awful BDSM, kinky stuff for adults. It's nice, cute, safe, innocent, safe for work, age regression. This is a personal bugbear of mine. Again, I know it's going to be controversial. I can only say what I saw with my own two eyeballs on the internet. I feel like these terms are probably around to stay, so I'm not saying we should like burn them with fire or whatever, but there is a level of like retconning and false history that I think has gone into these terms, that because the people in these communities are very invested in them, they're just willing to repeat it whole cloth, even though they weren't actually around when these things started to be used more broadly, and like the people who started to use them were like distinctly 9 out of 10 times minors who were told they could not do kink because they were not old enough to be able to do so. So that is something that I saw personally change, where that used to never be a thing. It was not a term, to where now it's like people acting like it's been around for like 20 years, but it absolutely, like in a concrete communal way, it has not been. So, but that's my own experience with that. And then finally, the last thing I want to talk about here, and this is maybe not the most fun note to end on, but it is a true one, is we are getting more of a spotlight on us every day. Like, we've had fits and starts of it. We had 50 Shades of Grey. We had different eras where we would be more in the news, more in the media for whatever reason. And I feel like now is a different time, because when I was in the scene, like first starting out, before I was in the scene, I was very aware of and knew about the 50 Shades of Grey discourse. And it was still happening when I was fresh in the scene. That was different. That was like a lot of people in media defending BDSM from 50 Shades of Grey and trying to promote better understanding, with a portion of people still being confused and, still glorifying an unhealthy relationship, and that was still there. But now I feel like a lot more of the attention are people that do not mean us well, people that see us as another sort of angle to the identity politics culture war, where kink can be another way to malign, drag queens who are stand-ins for trans people, because those are always the same thing apparently now. And like, it's just, well, it's queer and it's kinky, so therefore it is degenerate and wrong and icky and evil and gross, and they're trying to make our kids be into weird things, and it's bad and gross. And because a man at a pride event who's 70 years old was wearing a leather cap, therefore we can't trust queer people around our kids. Like, it's not great. I have seen, just this year alone, multiple doxing attempts. I've seen news articles about this from far-right publications. I have seen people like Matt Walsh talk about this. I've seen people like Tim Pool talk about this, not in necessarily a big way, mostly more in the, like, laughing at the weird people on the internet kind of a way. But I feel like they're testing the waters to be like, ooh, is this a group that we can tentatively, like, make fun of and malign other people, like, through association with them? And that makes me very uncomfortable. I am very worried about that aspect of the future of the kink community, in terms of unwanted public attention from groups that don't mean well. So keep your wits about you. Be careful about going to in-person events. Be careful about your identity online and how you associate that with your kink social media. Like, just, I would advise caution, especially if you are in an area of the country in America where that is going to be more of a concern. Obviously, if you are like Canadian or from the UK or Germany, probably don't have to worry about this quite as much as we do here in America. But, I don't know what's going on with the politics of kink in Germany. So maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I don't read German news, so maybe I'm missing something there. But I think as a community, if we continue to stick together and focus on just building each other up and being there to support each other, as I'm really seeing that we're doing right now, if we just keep that going, I think we're going to be okay. So on that note, I've been talking for 40 minutes. That's far too long. Thank you all so much for watching this. I hope that you all enjoyed this. I love to hear your own retrospectives. If you have been in the scene for 5 years, 10 years, 20 plus years, let me know what you have seen that has changed in that time. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree maybe? Let me know in a comment down below. If you enjoyed this and already, please do subscribe, because I make videos twice a week about all different kink and BDSM related topics. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best you can do that is with Patreon. A link to that will be down below. If you do already support over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.